All right, so the next step is let's start creating some parameters to try and follow. So I've made a track here that is E minor, D major, C major, D major. So again, it's in the key of E minor, which is the same as the key of G major in terms of its chords and the notes we're using, all that sort of thing. So we're not leaving the key of G major. We're just focusing on E minor, D, C, D. So if you know anything about modes, this would be E Aeolian or E natural minor. Okay? And if you don't sweat it. You're just doing the same thing we've been doing. The only difference now is we're going to look at this from two different perspectives. We're going to look at this both from a rhythmic perspective, a chordal perspective, and we're also going to look at this from a solo builder perspective. So let's start with the chord perspective first, okay? So again, if you think in your head, how do you normally play E minor, D, and C? And you might come up with, E minor and D and C, and there's perfectly fine. No, D major. Or you might do E minor and D and C, or E minor, D, whatever it is that you do. Let's start using our triad logic to start thinking about some unique voicings that we could do with some of these chords through these triads and arpeggios that we've been studying, right? So if we think about it, we can just pick a spot to go to. Let's say we do this. Like what I would do is I would choose this one, for instance. I would go down to this E minor that I've got sitting right there, and I might do something with that, but let's use this shape right now. Okay, so if you look at that, what are we playing? What note is this? It's G, B, and E, right? So our G is on top, so think about that. Okay, so G, B, and E, so E, G, B, right? Okay, so there's our chord sitting there. First inversion. Okay, that would be E minor. Now we know that D is coming up, so what do we want to do? Well, the trick here is when you're using these ideas, kind of fragmented chords, if you will, is trying not to move a lot. Because what I always tell people is when I think of like E minor, D, and C, and there's nothing wrong with doing that at all. As a matter of fact, that's what I did on the track when I made it for you. But what we're doing is we're adding another level to this. And again, I always think of this as this kind of playing, these kinds of chords are things that I do when I play in church. Most of the time when I play in my bands, they're usually heavy bands and I'm doing a lot of power chords and crazy stuff like that. But when I play in church, I'm doing a lot of this kind of stuff. Why? Because I'm playing with another guitar player, and that other guitar player more than likely is doing, open chords or bar chords or something like that. And that's great. Somebody needs to hold that down. But because somebody's already doing that, I'm looking for another voicing. That's my job. So I'm going to think E minor is sitting here. Okay, and what's really nice about that smaller triad voicing is that it's not fat, it's not thick, right? It's right to the point, so you can really hear those notes. And sometimes I might even play just the outsides of that shape. Right? It just depends. Okay? Anyway, so the next chord we've got is D. So then I'm thinking to myself, well, where could I go? Well, I could go up here. So now I've got this upper movement. Okay? Or I could go, and I could go to D down here. You see that? So what do I got? F sharp, A, and D. Right? So I could go there if I wanted to. So it just depends on what kind of voicing I'm looking for. Well, then we've got C coming up, right? Now, I could take this same shape and move it down, which would wind up being like your C chord down here. But again, I'm not trying to make something that sounds quite that kind of parallel. So what I would do is I would take my E minor and move down. And then this is maybe where I'd come up to this C. And then I could go back down to this D or go up to this D. So let's look at a couple of different ways we could do this. So E minor, D, C, to D. Keep it all closed like that. Or maybe I go And then, so it raises it at the end. There's this elevation in pitch at the end, okay? Or maybe I'll go E minor to D, and then C, and then D down here. That might be kind of cool, all right? So E minor, D, what if we went to C here, and then D up here? And now we've got this elevation happening where we're moving up. So we're moving from E minor, to D, and then C, and then to D. Well, that gets me thinking about another idea. So now what I could do is maybe instead of starting down here with my E minor, I start thinking of somewhere else I could go. Well, I know I've got an E minor right here. And again, I'm just on the second, third, and fourth strings for our example right now. I like playing these voicings on those strings because it's not too high and it's not too low. It's kind of right in the center, and it works quite well for voicings for an alternate guitar part, okay? But you can see now I could have the same idea. So E minor to D, to C, to D, and the whole thing could descend, and that could sound kind of cool. You see, it doesn't always have to be a system where you're going E minor, D, C, D, right? There's nothing wrong with that. I'm just saying you can step outside that and start thinking, well, D is here, but D is also here. Or maybe I go E minor, and then I want D. Now that drops the voicing, right? So what if I wanted to go higher? E minor, okay? I could come up here to D. And then what do I want to do for C? Well, I could drop down, right? But maybe I don't want to drop down. Maybe I want to come up here, and then D, I could elevate that, or maybe go to a different voicing entirely. Now this one's more of a power chord voicing because there's no third in there. So I'm playing 12, 14, and 15. But I'm just saying it's available to me, right? I could be thinking about that. Or maybe I wanted to drop back down. So maybe I go E minor to D, to E minor, and then back down to D, or maybe I move it up. It's entirely up to you, but it's just something to think about a little bit. So as this track is playing, what I want you to do is just try a few different fragments. And I love to do this with students where I just have them try and play things. And again, you might have to push stop and just work with this a little bit until you get used to it. Don't expect that this is all new and your brain is just going to attach it and you're always going to be able to use it. But the more you practice this, the easier it's going to get, right? So when the music starts, you might do something. You see, and you can do whatever you want, just practicing those sorts of things. So don't just think of this course as something where you're learning how to solo. That's absolutely valid. But you can definitely use this stuff in your rhythm playing. And I find that with most players, the more you learn about to see these shapes and be able to use this stuff rhythmically, this stuff all changes your perception of how you're going to solo too, right? Because as you're looking at this stuff, you're seeing this E minor sitting here thinking... And then here comes your D. Probably should play that. And then C. And then D. You know, whatever it is we're going to be doing. So the more you can visualize this stuff, the easier it's going to get. Okay? So let's talk about that for a second. So now we've got this E minor, D, C. We're going to talk about the soloing part. E minor, D, C, D. So before we jump into what I just did, let's just start real basic and start developing our understanding of this harmony of, in this case, E minor would be E, G, and B. Okay? So over this E minor, I've got E, G, B, that I can play. Those are kind of my target notes. But the problem is that right away, Here comes D. So now all of a sudden it's changing. So we got D and F sharp and A. And then all of a sudden C comes up. Well, now we got C, E, and G, right? So this is all happening. So instead of trying to just follow those all right away, let's start with something more basic, okay? Let's just start by trying to explore this a little bit with our ear before we even get into the logic of these things. So just try and explore it a little bit with our ear. And what I want you to do is over each chord, just play one note. Just play one note. It doesn't matter what. Just play it and see how it sounds, okay? So let me show you an example. And what I want you to notice is when you're practicing this, and again, you could do any string you want. Just give yourself one string, give yourself one note over each chord. And don't worry about the logic of it. We're going to come into that. That's the next thing. What I want you to do is see if your ear connects to that consonance or that dissonance that happens when you hit a note that is correct in terms of its harmony connecting to the chord. And sometimes it doesn't. Like when I stayed on that E, you might have noticed that all of a sudden what was happening is that E isn't working great over all three of those chord changes, but if I stay there and I stand my ground, okay, it might become something that is thematic, if you will, and part of the melody that I'm creating, and the ear will go, okay, I get it, because you're trying to tell me that this is really important. There's a vast difference between these two things that I'm talking about, knowing what you're doing and pushing an idea because you want to push it. These two things are vastly different than just moving around and hoping that you land on the right notes at the right time, right? Now, again, don't get me wrong, we do that a lot. But the more we can add in something where we are situating ourselves for a real connection, you're going to feel and you're going to hear how awesome it sounds. Okay, so step one right now, all I want you to do is I want you to kind of screw around a little bit, playing one note on one string, just stay on one string, whatever you choose. We're in E minor or G major, however you want to look at this, pentatonic, diatonic, whatever you want. And just play that for a little while, and when you're ready, come back and let's keep going.